towards Israel. Durable security cannot be achieved solely through force. It must be built on mutual recognition, justice, and rights for all. A better path exists that resolves this conflict, de-escalates regional tensions, and achieves a shared vision for peace. The upcoming high-level international conference in June, co-chaired by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, presents a critical opportunity. It must not be another rhetorical exercise. It must launch a path towards ending the occupation and realizing the two-state solution based on international law, UN resolutions, and previous agreements. A path that unifies the West Bank and Gaza and results in a Palestinian state existing in peace and security alongside Israel, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. We need to pivot ourselves from declarations to decisions. We need to implement rather than adopt new texts. Mr. President, since the resumption of hostilities in Gaza, the already horrific existence of civilians has only sunk further into the abyss. This is man-made. When speaking of our fellow human beings in Gaza, words such as empathy, solidarity, and support have lost their meaning. We should not become accustomed to the number of people killed or injured. These are daughters, mothers, young children whose lives have been shattered. All have a name, all had a future, all had dreams and aspirations. Since the collapse of the ceasefire in March, civilians have constantly come under fire, confined to ever-shrinking spaces, and deprived of life-saving relief. Israel must halt its devastating strikes on civilian life and infrastructure. The entire population in Gaza is facing the risk of famine. As the Secretary General has said, families are being starved and denied the very basics. On May 18th, the United Nations was informed by the Israeli authorities of the approval for the resumption of limited aid entry into Gaza. Since then, very limited numbers of goods have entered and have been distributed by the United Nations and its partners. But this is comparable to a lifeboat after the ship has sunk. The United Nations, including UNRWA, will continue to provide humanitarian assistance based on the principles of impartiality and neutrality. We have a plan in line with international humanitarian law and Security Council Resolution 2720. We remain committed to engage with all parties to implement this. We cannot, as has been stated often, participate in any mechanism that violates humanitarian principles. And allow me to reiterate that aid cannot be negotiable, and there can be no question of forced displacement. Civilians in Gaza have lost hope, Mr. President. Instead of saying goodbye, see you tomorrow, Palestinians now say, see you in heaven. Death is their companion. It's not life, it is not hope. Palestinians in Gaza deserve more than survival. They deserve a viable and vibrant future. Ultimately, any sustainable solution for Gaza is political. Agreements and work on post-war arrangements for security and governance should not wait any longer. This includes support for a reformed, revitalized, and empowered Palestinian government to govern Gaza and West Bank. And Israel's legitimate security concerns must be met. The region has a vital role to play, with active engagement by the international community. Mr. President, while Gaza rightly captures the world's attention, the West Bank is on a dangerous trajectory. Developments are best described as accelerating de facto annexation through settlement expansion, land seizures, and settler violence. And if not reversed, this will make the two-state solution physically impossible. Israeli security operations in the northern West Bank, particularly in refugee camps, and ensuing armed exchanges have resulted in many Palestinians killed, including children, thousands displaced, and many without home. Attacks by Palestinian militants have also continued, resulting in Israeli civilian casualties, including the death of a pregnant woman. Violence against civilians from any side is never justified. Mr. President, when talking about the occupied Palestinian territory, it is time for the Palestinian leadership to overcome internal divisions and focus on effective and inclusive governance. The Palestinian Authority embodies decades of investment in state building by this very same international community. And the international community needs to continue to support and protect Palestinian institutions. But reforms must continue to ensure the Palestinian Authority's viability, legitimacy towards its own population, and its ability to resume its responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority needs to rise to this historic challenge. However, the absence of a political process to end the conflict, coupled with stalled reforms and Israeli economic, administrative, and security measures, significantly hamper real-time progress. Mr. President, in closing, I would like to reinforce the following points. 1. Humanitarian aid and assistance urgently need to reach all civilians across Gaza in accordance with international humanitarian law. The UN's position and plan are well known. 2. The people of Gaza cannot afford to wait for the resumption of essential services. Livelihoods and human dignity need to be restored. Early recovery needs to resume immediately. 3. Forced displacement of civilians must unequivocally be rejected and prevented as per international law. Palestinians should be supported to stay on their land. 4. Post-war Palestinian governance and appropriate security arrangements in Gaza are needed that address the needs and rights of Palestinians and legitimate security concerns of Israel. The territorial and political unity of Gaza and the West Bank must be preserved. Fragmentation undermines the prospects for peace and a viable two-state solution. And of course, 6, that can also be point number 1, I'd like to reiterate the unconditional release of hostages and the return of the remains to their families. They need to come home. International engagement and alignment are critical. In the spirit of, to some, a well-known sculpture by Palestinian artist Salman Mansour, 1996, called Palestine Disappearing. I invite you to look it up. We need to act before it is too late. The responsibility lies with the parties and also with us, the international community. We need to act now to reverse the current trajectory. A well-defined, widely supported and time-bound political process accompanied by safeguards and guarantees is essential. Statehood is a right. It is not a reward. Let us not be remembered as the generation that let the two-state solution disappear. Let us be the generation that chose courage over caution, justice over inertia, and peace over politics. Let's be part of the generation that can make this happen. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mrs. Kak for her briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Feroz Shitwa, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Council. My name is Dr. Feroz Sidwa. I am an American trauma and critical care surgeon based in Stockton, California. I come before you today to speak about the Gaza Strip, where I have volunteered twice since October 7th. First at European Hospital from March 25th to April 8th of last year, and most recently at Nasser Medical Complex from March 6th to April 1st of 2025. Both are in the city of Khan Yunis. I'm not here as a policymaker or a politician. I am a physician bearing witness to the deliberate destruction of a healthcare system, the targeting of my own colleagues, and the erasure of a people. The Constitution of the World Health Organization states that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security and is dependent on the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. I've taken this to heart, and it is the reason I volunteer in conflict zones from Haiti to Ukraine to Gaza. In Gaza, I operated in hospitals without sterility, electricity, or anesthetics. Surgeries took place on crowded and filthy floors. Children died not because their injuries were unsurvivable, but because we lacked blood antibiotics, and the most basic supplies that are readily available in any large hospital anywhere else in the world. I did not see or treat a single combatant during my 5 weeks in Gaza. My patients were 6-year-olds with shrapnels in their heart and bullets in their brains, and pregnant women whose pelvises had been obliterated and their fetuses cut in two while still in the womb. Mothers sheltering in the hospital cooked bread on hot plates in the emergency department during mass casualty events, as we dealt with the rain of fire and death falling around us everywhere. Mr. President, the foundations of life in Gaza, family, health, and community, have been shattered. The medical system has not failed. It has been systematically dismantled through a sustained military campaign that has willfully violated international humanitarian law. Civilians are now dying not just from the constant airstrikes, but from acute malnutrition, sepsis, exposure, and despair. Between my 2 visits to Gaza, I witnessed a sharp decline in patients' health, driven not just by injury, but by worsening hunger and malnutrition that left their bodies weaker, their wounds slower to heal, and their survival far less certain. And let's not forget, this is a man-made catastrophe. It is entirely preventable. Participating in it or not, allowing it to happen is a choice. This is a deliberate denial of conditions necessary for life: food, shelter, water, and medicine. Preventing genocide means refusing to normalize these atrocities. It means refusing to dehumanize the Palestinians, to refuse to see them as calories counted or numbers of trucks moved. We see now that this way of thinking has brought about a human dignity crisis, with an entire people on the edge of survival. On March 18th, the ceasefire was violated by Israel. That day, I witnessed the most extreme mass casualty event of my career at Nasser Medical Complex. 221 trauma patients arrived in one morning. 90 were dead on arrival. Nearly half were severely injured children. No health system on earth could cope with this, least of all one that is besieged and starved of supplies. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries. Healthcare workers and first responders are supposed to be protected. Children are supposed to be protected. In Gaza, these protections are simply gone. Every day, the distinction between combatant and civilian is erased. Most of my patients were preteen children, their bodies shattered by explosives and torn by flying metal. Many died. Those who lived often awoke to find their entire families gone. Last year, I published in the New York Times a survey of 65 American healthcare workers who had served in Gaza. 83% of them reported seeing children shot in the head or the chest. I personally treated 13 such cases in my 2 weeks at European Hospital. According to the War Child Alliance, nearly half of Gaza's children are suicidal. They ask, why didn't I die with my sister, my mother, my father? Not out of extremism, but out of unbearable grief. I wonder if any member of this council has ever met a 5-year-old child who no longer wants to live, let alone imagined a society in which so many young children feel this way. And what astonishes me is not that some children in Gaza have lost the will to live, but that any still cling to hope. My Palestinian friends, mostly healthcare workers, no longer speak of resilience or even survival. Parents memorize their children's clothing in case they must identify their remains later. They pray for one piece of bread to give them before they sleep so that their children might die less hungry if they are killed at night. And meanwhile, my Israeli and American friends express horror at what is being done in their names. Many of us cannot understand how our governments continue to arm this senseless destruction, but you in this chamber have the power to stop it. Mr. President, I am here because I have witnessed what is happening in Gaza with my own eyes, especially to children, and I cannot pretend not to have seen it. You too cannot claim ignorance. I urge the Council, and especially my own government, to act with urgency on these enforceable measures. 1, demand an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including a halt to all arms transfers to all parties to the conflict, alongside targeted and lawful sanctions on Israel. 2, demand the reopening of all of Gaza's crossings and guarantee unrestricted medical evacuations, including to hospitals in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where Palestinian patients can be treated by Palestinian doctors, with safe return to Gaza assured. 3, guarantee sustained humanitarian access throughout Gaza, allowing all essential supplies, shelter, food, water, fuel, and medical supplies, to reach all people in need. 4, strongly and explicitly reject the weaponization and politicization of aid embodied by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, whose executive director, a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, publicly resigned on Sunday, citing the foundation's lack of adherence to humanitarian principles. We must affirm support for existing UN mechanisms, back UNRWA, and ensure NGOs with expertise in reaching and providing specialized care to those in need have unimpeded, full access. 5, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. 6, the immediate and unconditional release of all healthcare workers, including Dr. Hussam Abu Sufia, now held in Israeli detention for more than 150 days. And 7, without delay, uphold the UN Charter and act now to prevent genocide. One day, Gaza's survivors may have a record of the empty promises made by the members of this council as their wounds deepened and their lives were lost. If this council remains silent and fails to act now, that record will stand as a testament to a global failure to provide urgent care and to the collapse of our collective conscience. I'm pleading with you to do what you were entrusted to do, to protect international peace and security, and to prevent irreversible harm. The steps I mentioned are the very least that is needed. I'm asking my own government's representative to hear the voices of the majority of Americans who are calling for the same. If this continues, there will be no Palestinian doctors left, no one to care for the sick and wounded. There will be no Palestinians left to rebuild the healthcare system. We are losing a generation before our eyes, condemning people to die of hunger, disease, and despair, deaths that could be easily prevented. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Shitwa for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Coordinator Cog and Dr. Sidwa, for your briefings. First, let me express condolences on the tragic murders of Israeli embassy officials Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Milgram, an American citizen, at a Jewish community event last week in Washington. Yaron and Sarah were murdered for no other reason than the assailant wanted to kill Jews. It is horrific and shameful. We can and must do better to combat the sickening rise of anti-Semitism around the world. May their memories be a blessing. I think it's worth noting Yaron's final post before his murder on the social media platform X addressed anti-Semitism at the UN. Specifically, it condemned Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Tom Fletcher for spreading anti-Semitic lies. When he addressed this council on May 13th, Under-Secretary General Fletcher used language invoking the charge of genocide against Israel. Last week, he claimed that 14,000 babies were about to die within 48 hours, an abject falsehood. These kinds of remarks are absolutely unacceptable for an official in his position. Last week, Yaron and Sarah were murdered simply for attending an event for young Jews. The irony? The event discussed finding ways to bring aid to Gaza. But that didn't matter. They were targeted because of who they were. The United States has been working tirelessly to free the hostages and bring this war to an end, one that Hamas brutally started. Yet in the most delicate of moments, some member states remain unwilling to condemn the terror group responsible. Forget that these actions endanger hostages. The actual outcome is condemning civilians in Gaza to remain under Hamas's control for another generation. For our part, the United States will continue its effort to bring about a diplomatic agreement that will free the hostages. Hamas continues to reject proposals from the United States, Qatar, and Egypt that would release the 58 remaining hostages who have now been cruelly held for 600 days and bring calm to Gaza. Every day, Hamas demonstrates its lack of regard for the Palestinians it claims to represent, all while it violently suppresses protests against its barbaric rule and diverts aid meant for civilians. The United States fully stands behind Israel and its right to defend itself. In order to move forward, Hamas must be defeated. As Secretary Rubio has said, if an ember survives, it will spark again into a fire. There can be no peaceful and prosperous Gaza as long as Hamas governs it by force. The Council should apply pressure on Hamas to disarm, leave, and free Palestinians in Gaza from Hamas's tyranny. Shielding Hamas from accountability only undermines Israel's security and prolongs Palestinian anguish. Hamas must release the hostages immediately, including the bodies of the 4 murdered Americans it continues to hold: Itai Hen, Gadi Huggy, Judy Weinstein Huggy, and Omer Nutra. We will not rest until every hostage has been returned from Gaza. Let us be clear. This council should be supporting the work of the negotiators. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. We support the new initiative to resume the flow of aid through pre-existing mechanisms in advance of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's mechanism becoming fully operational. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is an independent entity established to provide a secure mechanism for the delivery of aid directly to those in need. We call on the UN to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and Israel to reach agreements on how to operationalize this system in a way that works for all. One that provides the opportunity to deliver aid directly to civilians without diversion by Hamas and other terrorist and criminal groups. The United States will support a future for the people of Gaza that is free of Hamas and full of opportunity. As President Trump emphasized during his recent visit, before our eyes, a new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts and tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together. The United States will do its part to help forge this new reality alongside Israel and our Arab partners. But at the same time, the United States stands with Israel in unequivocally rejecting any effort to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state or impose conditions on Israel which would be an unconscionable reward for the heinous Hamas attack on Israel that massacred and brutally kidnapped Israelis and Americans. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Sigrid Skag and Dr. Feroz Sidwan for their statements. I want to seize this opportunity to express our support to Mr. Tom Fletcher for his briefing of last week on the suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, on the morning of Friday, May 23rd, Dr. Ala al-Najjar left her home for her shift at the Nasser Hospital. She didn't know it will be the last time she said goodbye to 9 of her 10 children. This pediatrician, who had spent her life saving children's lives, became a grieving mother, forced to identify the calcinated remains, the calcinated bodies of her own sons and daughters. The body delivered to the emergency room by her colleagues in the very corridors where she once gave hope to others. Dr. Najjar's children had names: Yahya, Raqan, Raslan, Jubran, Eve, Rifan, Sidin, Luqman, and Sidra. All were killed. The eldest was 12 years old. The youngest, just 6 months. These are these children. They were not members of a Center for Command and Control of Hamas. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, this is Dr. Najjar. As Dr. Najjar buries her children, her husband, Hamdi, is still lying in deep coma. And her 10-year son, Adam, critically wounded, is lying in the hospital. We hope he will be surviving. If Hamdi finally awakes, what will she tell him? And when Adam asks about his brothers and sisters, what story can she tell him? President, in another horrifying scene, young Warda Sheikh Khalil, a 6-year-old girl, tried to flee the flames. Tried to flee the flames. the flames engulfing her school, her shelter, after an Israeli airstrike. This shelter, meant to protect displaced civilians, became a crematory oven. Her mother and siblings were killed. Her father now clings to life. No one in Gaza is spared. Not doctors, not women, not children, and not the displaced. Not even hope itself. Mr. President, figures lost meaning. What is worth of saying 18,000 children dead? These are not only numbers. These are lives. These are dreams. These are voices, playtimes, lullabies. They were extinguished. They were the warmth of homes, the joy of classrooms. They were the pulse of neighborhood. The Israeli army killed them. They killed them deliberately in a mother's arms, in classrooms, in hospitals, in bread lines under staircases, and in tents. Their deaths were not collateral. They were the consequences of a system that sees Palestinian lives as not human, as disposable. There is no fading echo. It is a scream, and these horrors must end. The remaining survivors must be allowed to live. The world must see these children, the Palestinian children, the children of Gaza, as its own children. For Warda, for Ala, for the thousands, for the 18,000 who never got a chance to say goodbye, we must act. Mr. President, words of condemnation are no longer enough. We must act now. Since October the 7th, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more than 54,000 people. Yes, it's no more 53,000 people. Today, it's 54,000 people. Israel wounded more than 123,000 people. And since March 18 alone, more than 3,900 have been killed and over 11,000 wounded. How many more must die before action is taken by the Security Council? How many orphans must roam the ruins of Gaza? How much more blood must be spilled before this Council acknowledges that enough is enough? My country, Algeria, bears its responsibility and is determined to push the Council to act. The time for indecision is over. Mr. President, the Palestinian people were promised a sovereign state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital by the General Assembly, by this very Security Council, and by the international community. Yet, 3 decades after Oslo, the dream of a Palestinian state is vanishing under the boots of the Israeli occupation and the silence of the international community. The Israeli occupation persists, emboldened by impunity, by immunity. Settler violence surges. Settlement spreads. Palestinian land is swallowed inch by inch, and holy sites are desecrated while the world looks on. The global system means to uphold justice has become paralyzed. So we ask, what is expected of the Palestinians? Must they continue offering their children on the altar of global inaction? Does the international community still believe in a two-state solution? President, Palestinians, like all human beings, like all people, have the right to life, to dignity, to homeland. They are not an exception. We must resolve this conflict as its roots. Not just a lasting peace can exist. Not just and lasting peace can exist without the realization of the Palestinian people's right to an independent state. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune stated, and I quote, "We must act decisively to end the ongoing historical injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. We must urgently revive the peace process, which is currently facing an unprecedented deadlock. It is imperative to compel the occupying power to comply with the relevant United Nations resolutions and to adhere to its obligation. The solution is well known. It's time for its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kag and Dr. Sidwa for their important and thought-provoking briefings this morning. Mr. President, this Council has continuously discussed the immediate effect, devastating effect, of a number of concerning recent developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. In Gaza, we've discussed a disastrous humanitarian situation, more than 53,000 dead, over 100,000 injured, and the entire population on the brink of a man-made famine. As part of an overwhelming majority of voices in this Council, Denmark reiterates once again that humanitarian aid must flow freely and at scale into Gaza in line with international humanitarian law and the humanitarian principles. We have opposed an expanded Israeli military offensive, and we have called for an immediate end to the war, along with the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. In the West Bank, we've called for an end to settler violence and illegal settlements, which have recently accelerated an unprecedented speed. Yet, we continue to witness forced displacement, demolitions, and movement restrictions imposed on Palestinians. Mr. President, as we condemn the immediate effects of these developments, this Council has a responsibility to address their long-term impact on international peace and security. And let me make 3 points in this regard. First, the people of Gaza are starving. Starvation, especially for children, can cause irreversible harm that could impact the rest of their lives. The IPC warns that 71,000 children under 5 years old and 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women are threatened by acute malnutrition. We stress the need for Israel to take immediate action to protect the human rights to life. All parties to the conflicts are bound to comply with international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, including Palestinian children, from harm. We also recall that the right to food is a fundamental human right. Second, the war in Gaza has caused major destruction of civilian infrastructure with devastating effects on children's education. More than 95% of all schools in Gaza have sustained damage. 660,000 children are pushed out of school and have lost as much as 19 months of education. In occupied East Jerusalem, another 800 students were forced out of their classrooms earlier this month after Israeli forces forced the closure of 6 UNRWA schools. Losing access to education risks leading to long-term consequences for children's well-being and learning. Education is critical for coping with trauma of war, and we just heard this morning Dr. Sidwa assessing that half of Gaza's children are suicidal. And education is critical for building relevant skills needed to rebuild the country once the conflict is over. We reiterate that civilian infrastructure, including schools, must be protected, included by refraining from the use for military purposes. We call for Palestinian children's rights to safe education to be protected. Third, in the West Bank, Israel is taking control of record amount of Palestinian land, displacing Palestinians into isolated enclaves, making it virtually impossible to form a contiguous and viable future Palestinian state. We recall that the EU has adopted sanctions against violent extremist settlers and encourage other Council members to do the same. Recently, we've also taken note of the Israeli government's disturbing decision to initiate land registration in Area C and register it to private Israelis. Denmark reiterates that any attempt by Israel to annex Palestinian land would be unacceptable and violate international law. Mr. President, in Israel, Hamas' heinous terrorist attacks have caused extreme and lasting trauma and has pushed Israelis and Palestinians further apart. We continue to condemn the brutal terrorist attack and the ruthless hostage-taking by Hamas, and we reiterate our demand that all hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Taken together, these developments do nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis. Denmark remains firmly committed to Israel's security. However, this cannot come at the cost of the civilian Palestinian people and their right to live in peace and dignity. I therefore reiterate Denmark's urgent calls to Israel to halt the ongoing and intensified military offensive and immediately allow for the full resumption of humanitarian aid. The United Nations and humanitarian organizations must be allowed to work independently and impartially to save innocent lives now. We can neither ignore the devastating immediate effects of the current developments nor their long-term impact on future generations of Palestinians and the viability of the two-state solution. Denmark maintains that the two-state solution is the only viable path to achieve permanent peace and stability in the Middle East. We look forward to the upcoming conference on the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Parliament representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the Parliament representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to thank Special Coordinator Kak for her briefing today and for asks. I also want to thank Dr. Sidva for his testimony and for his work in Gaza. Mr. President, many times we have said we are lost for words, but we cannot repeat these phrases over and over again. Early on during our council term, I instructed my team to avoid lengthy explanations of the situation on the ground in our statements. This is for the briefers, who usually on a weekly basis, or even more often, inform us about the state of affairs. And here at the UN and in the Security Council, I think we are very lucky. We are very privileged. We are honored to have the best briefers on the situation on the ground. From Special Coordinator Kak to Undersecretary General Fletcher to civil society briefers like Dr. Sidva today. Our role is not to challenge the briefers. It's not to challenge the messages, but to address the message. Our role is to take positions, to be the one who takes into account briefings, the one who can carefully examine the positions of the others and find possibilities for the Council to react to threats of international peace and security. Mr. President, my statement can be summarized in one word and one sentence. The word is responsibility. And the statement is, we have responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Burning tents, striking school-turned shelters, continuously displaying civilians, causing hunger, shutting down hospitals, cutting essential services. These grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law have pushed thousands of civilians to the brink of survival. As the task of listing every single cruelty has become impossible, our responsibility not to remain silent has become clearer, and the responsibility to act. We have a clear responsibility to protect civilians. With the alarm bells ringing through the latest IPC report and the information circulating on the hunger in Gaza, we continue calling for immediate lifting of the blockade on Gaza. As the full blockade surpasses 2 months, we must be clear that the current volume of aid reaching Gaza is not enough, and that entry at scale and safe and unhidden distribution are urgently needed. Crossings need to be open. All possible corridors used and facilitation must be granted. Safe passage for medical personnel and humanitarian workers must be guaranteed. Time is of the essence. We repeat that any actor delivering humanitarian assistance must adhere to international humanitarian law and international principles on humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. We repeat our deep concerns over the new model of distribution of aid. We welcome the UN coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza, and as clearly underlined in today's statement by the EU High Representative Kallas, we recall the indispensable role of the UN in distributing humanitarian assistance. During the ceasefire, the UN proved that it can deliver if allowed. Mr. President, we have a clear responsibility to act. This is why Slovenia fully supports the ongoing efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to find a negotiated solution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on all parties to engage in good faith. This is why Slovenia strongly supports the conference on the two-state solution to be held in June under chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia. But we do believe these efforts should be done hand in hand with the action of the Security Council. Time is of the essence. The Council should be clear in its unambiguous demand for unimpeded humanitarian access, and that is why we support urgent action of the Council. We hope the Council will show unity when voting on a humanitarian resolution that is now being discussed among the elected members. Mr. President, remaining silent is not an option. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I'll give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le
Thank you,
Président,
Mr. President.
la France remercie la coordonnatrice spéciale, Madame Sigrid-Cade, et Monsieur le Docteur Feroz-Sidwa pour leurs exposés qui viennent nous rappeler le calvaire des populations civiles de Gaza. Monsieur le Président, la France n'oubliera jamais les atroces attaques terroristes du 7 octobre 2023, les otages encore à Gaza aux mains du Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes doivent être libérés, et le ministre l'a rappelé, ici même,
here
le Hamas
reiterated the fact that
ne fait pas et
Hamas
ne doit pas faire partie
is not
de la
and
solution
cannot
à Gaza.
be a part
Il
of the
doit
solution in
être
Gaza.
désarmé,
Hamas needs
il
to be
doit être
disarmed
politiquement
and must be
neutralisé.
politically
Mais la
neutralized.
population civile
However,
de
the
Gaza
civilians
n'est
in
pas
Gaza
le Hamas.
are not
Et elle
Hamas.
subit une
And
situation
civilians in Gaza are
humanitaire
enduring a humanitarian situation that is
face à laquelle
devastating.
ce Conseil doit
And
agir
the Security Council has
en
an obligation
continuant
to
à
act
exiger
in
d'Israël
response by
qu'il se
continuing to
conforme
demand
à ses
that
obligations
Israel
en vertu du
meet
droit
its obligations under
international
international
humanitaire.
humanitarian
Le
law,
Conseil
and
doit
the
agir
Security Council
et
must
adopter une
act
résolution
and
humanitaire.
adopt a humanitarian resolution.
Premièrement, toutes
Firstly,
les
all
entraves
obstacles
à l'entrée et à
to the
l'acheminement de l'aide
entry and
humanitaire
delivery
et
of
toutes les
humanitarian
restrictions
assistance
sur
and
les
all
quantités et la
restrictions
composition
on the
de celles-ci
quantity
doivent être
and
levées.
composition of this
Les
assistance need to
quantités
be lifted.
extrêmement restreintes entrées ces
The
derniers jours
highly
ne
limited
permettent pas
quantities
de
of
répondre aux
recent
besoins des
days
populations,
are
a
insufficient when it
fortiori
comes to meeting the
après
needs of the
11 longues semaines de
populations,
blocus total.
especially after 12
Les images
long
de personnes
weeks of total
affamées prenant
blockade,
d'assaut
the
des camions
images
et des points
of
de distribution de l'aide
desperate,
en sont
starving
une
people throwing
illustration
themselves
tragique.
on trucks and
Des
aid
dizaines de
distribution
tonnes
points
d'aide
are a
financées
tragic
par la
illustration of
France
this.
et d'autres
Dozens
pays
of tons of
ne peuvent être
assistance
acheminés à
financed
Gaza.
by France
C'est
and other
inacceptable.
countries not being delivered to
Deuxièmement,
Gaza
nous
is unacceptable.
réitérons
Second,
notre plein
we
soutien aux
reiterate
Nations
our
Unies
full support for
et à
the
leurs
United
partenaires
Nations
humanitaires
and humanitarian
qui ont
partners
prouvé leur
thereof,
capacité
who
à
have
acheminer
demonstrated their
l'aide dans le
ability
plein
to deliver
respect
assistance
des principes
fully
humanitaires.
in line with
Nous saluons
humanitarian
le plan annoncé
principles.
le 16
We
mai
applaud
qui
the plan
renforce
that
les
was
garde-fous
announced on
contre les
16
risques de
May,
détournement
which
de
shores
l'aide.
up
Nous
safeguards
appelons à ce
against
titre
the
Israël
risks of
à
a
permettre le
diversion.
plein
And we
accès
call in
des
this regard
personnels
upon
des
Israel to
Nations Unies à Gaza
facilitate and to
afin
allow
de
for full
vérifier la
access of
délivrance
UN
de l'aide
personnel to
humanitaire
Gaza in
comme
order
le
to
prévoit
verify
la
the delivery of
résolution
humanitarian assistance
2770.
as stipulated
Je le répète,
in resolution.
nous apportons notre
In
soutien à
resolution
l'UNRWA,
2720,
au
we
secrétaire
recall our
général
support for
adjoint
UNRWA,
Fletcher et
the
à ses
Undersecretary General
services,
Fletcher,
à
and to his
l'ensemble
services,
des
and we support
agences,
all
fonds,
UN
programmes,
agencies, funds, and programs,
organisations du système
as
des
well as
Nations Unies,
systems
engagées sur le
who are
terrain pour
working
témoigner
on the ground,
honnêtement,
seeking to provide
impartialement
honest,
et agir
impartial
en humanité.
testimony and to
Nous
deliver
demandons à
on
Israël de
humanitarian
permettre aux
needs. We
Nations
call upon
Unies
Israel
et à leurs
to
partenaires
allow the United
humanitaires
Nations
d'opérer
and
en toute
humanitarian partners
sécurité.
to operate in full
La mise en
safety and
place d'un
security,
système
the
alternatif
establishment of an
qui ne
alternative
respecte
system
ni le droit
which respects
international,
neither
ni ses
international
principes
law nor
humanitaires et
humanitarian principles
engendrerait des
thereof, and
déplacements
which
forcés de
may
population n'est tout
engenders
simplement pas
forced
acceptable.
displacements of people is
La
simply
journée d'hier a montré
unacceptable.
de façon criante
Yesterday was
les
a
limites du
stark
dispositif mis en
illustration
place par
of the
Israël.
limitations of the mechanism that
La
Israel
France
has
rappelle en
established.
outre sa ferme
Moreover, France
opposition à tout
recalls
projet
its
d'occupation
firm
permanente
opposition to
par
any permanent
Israël de la
occupation
bande de
planned by
Gaza
Israel
et de
for the Gaza
déplacements
Strip
forcés
and
de la
the
population.
forced displacement
Ces
of
violations graves du droit
people.
international
These
mèneraient à
grave
une impasse
violations of
absolue.
international law
En outre,
are leading to
la
a
protection
complete
des populations
impasse.
et
Moreover,
infrastructures
the protection
civiles
of civilians
fait
and civilian
pleinement partie des
infrastructure
obligations
is
d'Israël
part and
au titre
parcel
des conventions de
of
Genève,
Israel's
les
obligations
frappes répétées
under
sur
the
des
Geneva
écoles,
Conventions.
des hôpitaux, des
Recurrent
habitations
strikes
civiles
targeting schools,
sont
hospitals,
inacceptables et doivent cesser.
homes are unacceptable and
Monsieur le
must
Président, il est
end.
urgent qu'Israël
Mr.
cesse ses
President, there's
opérations
an
militaires et
urgent
qu'un
need for
cessez-le-feu
Israel
permanent
cease its
soit
military
établi
operations for
à Gaza.
a permanent
La
ceasefire to be
France
established
appelle les
in Gaza.
parties à
We
revenir au
call
plein respect de
upon
l'accord de
the parties
cessez-le-feu
to revert
et
back to
salue les
full
efforts
respect
des
with the
États-Unis,
ceasefire, and we
du
applaud the
Qatar et
efforts
de
undertaken
l'Égypte
by
pour
the United
faciliter
States,
les
Qatar,
pourparlers.
and Egypt as they endeavor to
Je
facilitate
le réitère,
negotiations. I wish to
nous sommes
reiterate the
solidaires,
following.
sans
We
faille,
stand in
avec les familles de
solidarity,
tous les otages qui
solidarity
doivent
with all
être
the families of all of
libérés
the hostages who need to be
Nous réaffirmons le
released
droit
without delay. We
des
reaffirm
Israéliens à vivre
the
en
right
sécurité
of Israelis
et
to live in
condamnons
safety and
les
security. We
récentes attaques
condemn the
houthies.
recent Houthi attacks.
Mais l'urgence, c'est de
However,
construire
there's
une
an urgent
alternative à la
need
guerre
to
pour les
propose an
Palestiniens et
alternative
les
to war
Israéliens.
for Palestinians and
Une
Israelis,
alternative fondée
an
sur la solution à
alternative
deux États
rooted
et
in
la
the two-state
satisfaction des
solution,
aspirations légitimes des
one
deux
that
peuples,
reflects the
palestiniens et
legitimate
israéliens
aspirations
tout
of the
autant,
two peoples,
à avoir un État
Palestinians
et à
and
vivre
Israelis, to
en paix
have a
et en
state
sécurité.
and to live
La
in
France
peace
remercie
and
les États
security.
membres de leur
France thanks
mobilisation
member
lors de
states
la
for their
réunion
mobilization
préparatoire
during
du
the
23
preparatory
mai,
meeting on the
en
23rd of
particulier
May,
ceux qui ont accepté
specifically
la
those who
responsabilité
have
de groupe de
accepted
travail.
responsibility
Il faut
of the
maintenant
working
prendre des
group.
engagements
There's a
concrets,
need now to adopt
politiques, financiers et
concrete political,
matériels
financial,
pour
material
préserver la
commitments
solution à deux
to
États dans la
preserve the
perspective
two-state
de
solution
la,
with a
de
view
la
to
conférence
the
qu'avec
convening
l'Arabie
of the
Saoudite,
conference
la
which
France
France will
co-présidera
co-chair with
le
Saudi
17 au
Arabia on the
25 au 20
17th
juin
to the
2025,
20th of June
conférence internationale
2025.
convoquée
This is an
à la demande
international
de
conference which will be
l'Assemblée
convened at the
générale
request of the
en
General
soutien à la
Assembly
solution des États
to
ici à
support
New
the
York.
two-state solution
Le
here
ministre des Affaires
in New
étrangères
York. The
l'a
foreign
rappelé,
minister
la France
recalled
souhaite que cette
that
conférence
France
permette d'avancer conjointement
wishes to see
sur
this
la paix,
conference
la
resulting in
sécurité
meaningful
d'Israël et
progress
de
on
la
peace,
Palestine,
security for
la
Israel and
reconnaissance de la
Palestine, the
Palestine comme
recognition
État,
of
la
Palestine as a
normalisation et
state,
l'intégration
normalization
régionale, le
and regional
désarmement du
integration,
Hamas et la
disarmament of
rénovation de la
Hamas,
gouvernance
and
palestinienne.
the restoration of Palestinian governance. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, thank you for convening today's meeting. I also thank Special Coordinator CAG for her comprehensive briefing, and I have also listened carefully to the moving testimony of Dr. Sidwell. Mr. President, about 2 weeks ago, we received a sobering briefing from USG Tom Fletcher as he appealed to us to seriously examine the legacy of this Council, or the legacy this Council would leave in relation to what is currently taking place in Gaza. Today, we have again heard a similar appeal from Special Coordinator CAG and Dr. Sidwell, even as the situation continues to worsen in unimaginable ways. No one should be made to live under the horrific circumstances that Palestinians in Gaza have been experiencing since 7th of October. This Council must take principled and urgent action in response to the grave situation that has been foisted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Mr. President, as efforts continue for achieving a return to the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, Guyana is of the view that any peace deal reached should have at least 3 guarantees. First, Palestinians should not be forced to give up any of their rights in exchange for peace. Specifically, they should not be forced to forfeit their homeland. A choice between continuation of the Israeli offensive and forced displacement is a false choice. Second, any peace deal should comply scrupulously with international law. The war in Gaza has set, or seen attempts to set, precedents that are plain violations of international law, particularly international humanitarian law. Recall, for example, restrictions imposed on the United Nations and humanitarian workers. The Knesset legislation against UNRWA is a case in point. Recall also Israel's ongoing aid blockade and its proposed mechanism for aid delivery under the control of its military. Third, the protection and well-being of civilians should remain the chief consideration of any peace deal. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen in unimaginable ways, as described by Special Coordinator. We are especially concerned by the escalating strikes on tents, residential buildings, schools, and crowded hospitals, and the methodical destruction of entire neighborhoods. The constant evacuation orders and the militarization of the majority of the Gaza Strip are equally concerning. There is nothing that can justify this level of violence against civilians, among whom are children, including babies. The aid blockade, which was imposed on 2nd March, seriously crippled the humanitarian efforts that were facilitated by the ceasefire deal. While noting the recent lifting of some restrictions by Israeli officials, we simultaneously noted that certain measures are severely limiting humanitarians' ability to take advantage of this small respite. We noted, for example, the challenges created by insecurity, delays in coordination approvals, and inappropriate routes being provided by Israeli forces that are not viable for the movement of cargo. These are all man-made obstacles. We call on Israel to fulfill its international legal obligations regarding access to essential goods and services by the civilian population of Gaza. The provision of aid must be governed by the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. Guyana expresses its confidence once again in the ability of the United Nations and its partners to deliver aid at the required scale throughout Gaza, if given the relevant facility by the occupying power. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. The state of food insecurity in Gaza is also extremely worrying, with many Palestinians experiencing what they described as a slow death sentence. The testimony of humanitarians in Gaza that, and I quote, Palestinians prefer to die by an airstrike than to go through the suffering of a lack of food and lie to their children about their next meal, end of quote, is an indictment on those who have created these types of choices for innocent civilians. Mr. President, colleagues, it has not escaped us that while negotiations, which we welcome, are ongoing to reach a nuclear deal with the objective of avoiding the potential destruction of another country, different weapons are being employed against the Palestinian people, resulting in their destruction. Regrettably, we are not responding meaningfully to counter the actions of the Israeli Defense Force. What makes this even more concerning is the fact that the visuals of the decimation of Palestinians are live streamed across the globe, yet we are not acting to stop it. The judgment of future generations will be justifiably harsh towards us. We who saw the attempts at obliterating an entire people, but did not act. This Council has the opportunity to act now. Enough is enough. Mr. President, in light of the foregoing, Guyana is compelled to reiterate the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in accordance with Resolution 2735. Nothing justifies the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, and it is clear that the military objectives set by Israel cannot be met without severe consequences for civilians. Second, Guyana reiterates its call for the release of all hostages being held in Gaza, as well as all Palestinians detained by Israel without charge. The taking of hostages is a war crime, and all perpetrators must be held accountable. Third, Guyana appeals to Israel to completely lift the humanitarian aid blockade on Gaza and to allow the United Nations and its partners to carry out their life-saving work. International humanitarian law demands that Israel fulfill its obligations towards civilians, and the International Court of Justice has reaffirmed this. Finally, Guyana appeals to this Council and the international community as a whole to work urgently to revitalize the two-state solution as the only just and comprehensive solution to the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Presidency for convening this timely meeting in light of the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories. We thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefings and for her efforts at the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process. We also thank Dr. Feroz Sedwa for his briefings. We remain gravely alarmed by the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, where the continued military escalation has pushed the population to the edge of survival. There is quite simply no safe place to go in Gaza for civilians. The recent reports of famine risk, forced displacement, and destruction of vital infrastructures are deeply distressing. This is a crisis entirely man-made and preventable, which is exacerbated by the persistent denial of access to a life-saving aid. Somalia strongly condemns the ongoing restrictions on humanitarian access and calls for an immediate, safe, unhindered delivery for the assistance throughout Gaza. All border crossings, including Rafah and Karim Shalom, must be reopened, and international humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. We also express our concern regarding the mounting pressure on UNRWA and reiterate our full support for its critical role in serving the Palestinian refugees. Attempts to legitimize or defund the agency threatens not only the rights of the refugees, but also the broader stability of the region. We are further troubled by the continuous settlement activity and settlement violence against civilians in West Bank, and the erosion of the legal and historical status quo of the Jerusalem. The right of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination, return to their homeland and statehood, are not subject to negotiation or delay. Mr. President, the blatant disregard for binding decisions of International Court of Justice, including the provisional measures issued in January and March of this year, is a direct challenge to the international legal order. Israel, as occupying power, bears legal responsibility under the international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. These obligations are not optional. They are binding, and they must be enforced. Attacks on civilians and obstruction of humanitarian aid, targeting a medical facility, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war all demand independent investigation and credible justice redress. The consequences of this prolonged conflict are not limited to Gaza. The crisis has triggered widespread regional instability, increasing tensions across the Middle East. The situation risks spiraling into a broader confrontation with a serious implication for the international peace and security. Mr. President, this Council cannot remain silent as its innocent lives are lost and humanitarian norms are violated. We call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, the full restoration of humanitarian access across Gaza. Somalia supports all credible diplomatic efforts aimed at the escalation and the conflict resolution, including the upcoming International Peace Conference, co-hosted by Saudi Arabia and France. We urge the international community to seize this moment and relaunch a serious political process toward a just, lasting peace, one that guarantees the establishment of independent and sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. To conclude, Mr. President, my delegation reaffirms its commitment to working alongside fellow Council members and regional partners to uphold international law, defend humanitarian principles, and advance the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank Special Coordinator Karg and Dr. Sidwa for their briefings today, which painted a catastrophic picture. Let me pay tribute to you and to your humanitarian and health worker colleagues working tirelessly to alleviate this suffering. I'll make 3 points. First, the UK has always supported Israel's right to defend itself. It suffered a heinous attack by Hamas on 7 October, and the hostages have been through an unimaginable ordeal. We reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release and accountability for those responsible. But as my Prime Minister has said, we strongly oppose the Israeli government's escalating military action in Gaza, which is wholly disproportionate. An immediate ceasefire, not more bloodshed, is the way to secure the release of the hostages and stop the endless cycle of violence. Second, as we have heard again today, the level of human suffering in Gaza is intolerable. Civilians face starvation, displacement, and trauma. The UN warned of the risks from the Israeli government's plan for aid delivery. In Rafah yesterday, we saw this warning become a reality. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation lost control of its distribution centre, with multiple casualties reported and great distress for those desperately seeking aid. In contrast, the UN has a clear plan to deliver life-saving aid at scale. It contains robust mitigations against aid diversion. Brave humanitarians stand ready to do their jobs. 9,000 trucks wait at the border. Our message to Prime Minister Netanyahu is clear. Let aid in and enable the UN to operate now. We reiterate our support for the UN, OCHA, and all its aid agencies. We also reject the Israeli government's unacceptable intention to take control of the Gaza Strip. Permanent forced displacement is a breach of international humanitarian law. Third, President, in the West Bank, violent settlers continue to assault and abuse Palestinians, forcing entire communities to flee. In Jerusalem, provocative visits to holy sites and inflammatory language by Israeli ministers are adding to the tensions. On 20 May, the UK announced further sanctions on individuals and entities promoting violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. We will continue to act against those committing these abuses. President, the UK will not give up on a two-state solution. We will continue to work closely with France, Saudi Arabia, and all our partners towards a successful conference in June, which moves us towards this goal. Finally, let me finish by condemning the horrific murders of Yaron Lishinsky and Sarah Milgrim in Washington, D.C. last week, and offering condolences to their families and to their colleagues. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias,
Thank you
señor presidente.
very much, Mr. President.
Panamá Panama would like to thank you for convening this meeting, and we'd like to thank Madam Sigrid Kaag, Interim Special Coordinator for the Peace Process in the Middle East, and Dr. Sidwa Feroze. Thank them both for their briefings. And we recognize the representatives of Israel and the United Arab Emirates and the Observer State of Palestine, who honor us with their participation in this meeting. And we thank the briefers for the dramatic details they shared with us. Panama is very concerned about the testimony and images that bear witness every day to the fact that Gaza and the West Bank are going through a humanitarian catastrophe of devastating proportions. We reiterate our urgent call for a restoration of an immediate ceasefire that will facilitate safe access for vital humanitarian assistance and the immediate, dignified and unconditional release of all the hostages. President, the 7th of October 2023 was a turning point. On